Well, thank you, everyone. I'm a little bit rugged up at the moment. I might start disrobing as we go, as the heating in the office comes on. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Management. I'm actually an associate professor in planning, and I am a professional planner by trade. I'm also originally a geographer, and I see planning as a form of applied geography. This paper has been prepared with my co-authors Wendy William and Sandeepa Jaitunga. Also at Lincoln at the time, but Sandeepa has now left us to join a Crown Research Institute in New Zealand, Scion. And I say from the outset that any errors and omissions in this presentation are entirely mine, because neither of my co-authors of the chapter have actually seen the presentation, but we have been working together on the chapter, so their material is in here. I guess I will go straight into this. It's very difficult in a sense to speak to an international organisation about the New Zealand planning system, and I usually find myself having to spend about 15 minutes talking about how we actually do planning in New Zealand. I've tried to make this so that it doesn't do that, and trying to keep it to a minimum, but I will have to deal with the New Zealand planning system as I go through. So let's see how we go. What we set out to look at or to explore was what sort of governance systems might support healthy, resilient farming systems. And that was our sort of our starting point. And we looked internationally to see what people are doing in other countries, especially other developed countries like New Zealand. And we, in New Zealand, we have a very neoliberal sort of governance system. It's very individual rights based. It's focused on market solutions, and it essentially leaves public goods to either philanthropic or business folk, or to the public sector themselves. I'll come back to explain a bit more about that later on. What we saw overseas in a number of other countries, especially in Europe, was more sort of a communal approach, where there seemed to be a recognised shared responsibility for society and the environment. Were more community decision-making processes set up, and community often seems to fund public goods. So, for instance, they might have the government paying a subsidy to farmers to maintain their land, looking as if it's rural land, whereas in New Zealand, that just does not happen. There's a range of sort of approaches in between these, but we're not sure which works best. For the purpose of this presentation, we really start to look at our own sort of setup and see there's sort of a belief that neoliberal governance systems don't actually help farming necessarily, even though farmers are by and large individual businesses, that they tend to focus too much on that individual business rather than on the overall community benefit and the overall community good. And so that is part of one of the things we're sort of looking at in our particular context. If you have a neoliberal system, does that mean that you struggle to get a more cohesive bioregional ecosystem type approach to how you manage your environment? Okay. So I just want to say that we also focus on the high country, because that's sort of focus of pastoralism in New Zealand. And by high country, by and large, we mean the South Island. There is some high country in the North Island, but usually we're thinking South Island. And this diagram from a Simon Swalfield and Ken Huey article of about 2001 illustrates sort of the nature of the vegetation and where it's found in the South Island of New Zealand, and the sort of high country areas as defined by Kevin O'Connor some years earlier. So we have a western barrier of mountains that basically stop the rain coming in from the Tasman Sea from the west, lots of water falling on the western side. Won't really be talking about that. We don't think of that as being part of the high country as such because it's full of forest and it's very wet. We tend to think more in terms of the eastern side, the Eastern Range and Basin and the Otago Block and Basin sort of country, which is drier, has shrubland, but also a lot of tussock grassland. There's light yellow bits here, and is primarily sort of pastoral land around that. And that's the sort of area we think of as being the high country in New Zealand and the extensive pastoralism sort of area. Just for those of you who don't know, Lincoln University is just around here. So we're not far from that Tussock Mountain Grasslands area. In fact, we used to have an institute here called the Tussock Mountain Grasslands Institute. So just to put it in a little bit of context, I mentioned that we had this neoliberal sort of system in New Zealand. What that's tended to result in is down on the flatlands especially, a very commodity-driven monoculture, primarily dairying is taken over and is the big ticket item in New Zealand, driving the economy in many ways. But if you someone like me, you'll find this sort of rather bleak, some people describe it a green desert of grass and nutrients put on, very little shelter for the cattle, not a great life for cattle in some senses, although lots of people say that it's wonderful for them. They get fed and they have a nice life and produce milk and so on. The environmentally, it has been quite difficult. It has given us a number of problems with increased nutrients, especially nitrogen, getting into the groundwater, and we have major problems with our river systems. This has led to various descriptions of dairying as dirty dairying and so on, and there's been a big move to try and move away from that and try and control some of the effects of farming in New Zealand. That's been exacerbated by the effect of cattle and livestock in producing methane. And of course, with that, we also have sheep, but not the same extent as with cattle. So from a landscape design point of view, this sort of system that I'm looking at now in this picture is not terrifically attractive. It doesn't seem to work in the sense of a landscape design. May work quite well in terms of an efficient farm. The sort of archetypal image of the high country farm in New Zealand is a sort of a shepherd and his dog and a bunch of merino sheep. This is on Dunstan Downs, and it's going through this tussock grassland area, and in many senses this is equally a monoculture, but this is seen something closer to what it should more naturally be. It's not dramatically altered by irrigation or top dressing, although there has been pasture put into these sort of countries as well, in this countryside. And we're now seeing many challenges to that sort of grassland areas, and this is a centre pivot system that's been put in the Mackenzie country, which is in the sort of centre of the mountain lands. There's a lot more irrigation and that sort of green grass taking over in what was tussock land area than in this picture, but I felt this one was quite a dramatic standout illustration of the difference between the sort of new monocultural sort of dairy type approach and the traditional environment in which it's going. And this is a very popular area for tourists, both domestic and international. And there's a lot of concern about it being converted in this particular way, not to mention the impact on the ecosystems and species that live there. So there's quite a bit of controversy over what's happening in the Mackenzie country. And the Centre of Excellence in Design and Future Productive Landscapes at Lincoln happens to have a high country farm at Mount Grand. We're looking from the Mount Grand out towards Lake Hawea, and there's some, with all mountain stations, there is usually a flatland area in front of them, a little bit of flat area for the stock and so on as well, and for growing hay, etc. So it seemed quite natural for us at the centre to look at how this particular landscape, how this farm could connect into that landscape, into the community of Hawea, which is just over in the distance here, and see how we would how we could actually create a governance system that worked for that. Looking at the establishment of grazing rights in the Canterbury region, and this is from Garth Kent, and sorry, I've forgotten who the other author is. Article some years back, they analysed the stages at which grazing rights were obtained in New Zealand, and before 1861 they're fairly much coastal, not terrific, lot of grasslands allocated. Then the grazing rights were allocated in sort of two sways after that. One set between 1861 and 1864 in the sort of the flatlands and lowlands areas, and then 1865 to 69, yes, 1855 to 59 in the higher country here. So moving in here, this is Lake Hawea that we're looking at. Oh, it isn't, sorry. This is like Tekapo, Pukeki and Ohau, sorry, Lake Pukeki here, and the high country of Canterbury. And then in the very later stage, you've got the really high blocks allocated after about 1859. So sort of a two-stage movement into the back country of allocating grasslands. Of course, before the European arrived, the mountain lands were known to the indigenous people, the Maori, and they have their own legends and views of that landscape. So the Torres Ranges here, Kuratawhiti, was an ancestor who came to New Zealand on the Arai Te Ura canoe, and after the canoe overturned in a storm, the crew apparently struggled ashore and headed inland, and when the morning dawned, they had turned to stone. There's one of the stories of the meaning of this backcountry areas for indigenous Maori. And I think it's possibly important to realise also that the mountainland area country is behind here, the basin sort of areas behind here is contested somewhat in that in the land that was sold to the Crown by Maori is seen by Maori, especially Ngāi Tahu, as being from the foothills to the coast, whereas it was mapped as being much more extensive. And there's still an argument that the mountain lands in behind this could in fact be indigenous owned land. However, it has been allocated as farmland to farmers in New Zealand. Maori also traditionally travelled through through and across the high country, going to the west coast to get greenstone and things like that. And one of their tracks up around here comes to Lake Hawea and comes out just near the university station, Mount Grand Station. So there's a lot of movement by Maori across the high country, temporary settlements and temporary harvesting of moa and other sorts of species on the way. And that tramping has continued to the modern day, but as much by Europeans and so on, as the high country has become sort of a playground, place that you go and spend time in by tramping into the high country. So we're seeing the use of the high country. When we think about it as being pastoral, we also have to realise it's not just pastoral farming that occurs in the high country. I'm just going to highlight that with some of the other activities that happen in the high country, because I think we tend to get a little bit myopic at times and think just in terms of our own sector. So in the high country, we have a lot of hydroelectric power generation, especially in the Mackenzie country, but as well as that, we have a lot of angling for fish, trout and salmon, introduced species, and there's time and effort put into establishing angler facilities as part of those hydroelectric power canals, and that comes with its own administrative system of fish and game councils who have responsibility for those angler facilities and for controlling freshwater fish species, sport species. We also have occurring in the high country a different sort of farming, salmon aquaculture, occurring in the hydroelectric power canals. And we have, as I've indicated before, tourism is quite popular in the high country, and a number of farms have augmented their farming by adding in tourist activities that are seen as compatible with the farming. Some of it is glamping, where they actually provide you with a fairly flash house or campsite, and all your cares are taken care of for you. Others are these sort of tours of key areas and sites. So tourism, big issue, very important in the high country, and supplementary income for farmers. Some parts of the high country have been recognised internationally for various things, in this case for Stark Sky Reserve at Mount John, and the attractiveness of that night sky mean that people have their protections put as to how much light can be emitted in those sort of areas, but it's also indicative of the of another value of that high country area. And of course, the high country has been used for all sorts of movies, particularly Lord of the Rings as Edoras. They have removed all the props and so on, but this is in the high country as well. And so having to cope with and provide, that provides values to the tourism industry as well. In the last 50 years, the vineyards has also taken off in the high country, somewhat of a surprise to many people. This is at Wanaka, which is right in the heart of the high country, surrounded by high country farmland, and little patches being broken off and turned into vineyards, high value product. And the other pressure occurring, of course, in an attractive area with nice mountains and so on is ongoing urban growth and subdivisions occurring everywhere and then spreading out over the farmland. So the point I'm trying to make here is that when we think of the high country, there's this tendency to think, as I said, of the archetypal farmer with his dog and or her dog and the merino sheep grazing around it. And we think of this is, of course, focusing on grazing, but we can't see that in isolation. There are all these other users and demands on the high country, and we have to cope with those as well. And one of the aspects that's occurred over the last couple of decades has been a tenure review, because a lot of the high country was held by the Crown and leased out to farmers on a more or less a 99-year lease in perpetuity sort of arrangement, where you could lease it for 99 years and they'd be rolled over for another 99 and so on. So farmers established in the high country on land that they didn't actually own necessarily, and leasing it from the Crown and farming it pastorally in this particular way. There's been a move on, or there was a move on, which has just ended, to review the tenure of those farms and to separate out the land that should be put aside for conservation and that which could be freeholded to the farmer. So in this particular case, Island Hills, the land was split up with 1,600 hectares going to the Crown as conservation estate, 3,200 being freehold, but having restrictions on use, and those restrictions relate to limited grazing and other aspects to enable the conservation values of the land to survive. In this sense, the grazing is seen as part of the maintenance of those values. And then only 200 hectares going freehold with no restrictions on it. However, what has been pointed out by Anne Brower in a number of articles is that 200 of freehold is actually highly valuable, and what can often happen with that 200 hectare freehold is that once it becomes freehold, it becomes vineyards, or it gets converted into subdivisions and sold, and you suddenly have a quite different character of the high country emerging, and you have those high country farmers slowly disappearing. There's even been programs on the vanishing lands based around those sort of issues. So they've ceased that tenure review at the moment, partly to deal with the loss of value to the public of the high value land being sold off at a very cheap rate, freeholded very cheaply, and partly for other conservation reasons. So if we summarise all that, and I've borrowed an image from Wanaka's catchment plan here, you have a number of aspects pressing on the high country. You've got rural development pressures, as people want to develop the farms to be more financially viable and pushing for freeholding. You've got urban development pressures increasing, especially around places like Queenstown and Wanaka, and Hawea will be the next one that goes, Tekapo, all through that high country area. We have had, until COVID, increasing tourist numbers and recreational activity in the high country of all sorts. And we have an introduction and spread of pest flora and fauna. So we have issues around that as well, from our high country lakes to dealing with rabbits and things like that. And lurking in the background is this problem of climate change, which we've yet to fully come to grips with, but we need to build resilience into our farming systems to cope with that. So in terms of looking at the high country, currently in the South Island, and I haven't got the high country, as I showed those maps before, is essentially around this sort of area here. There are different administrative bodies over that. Now this, I've used this image here, is of the conservancies. These are the conservation authorities that have responsibility for monitoring the role of the Department of Conservation, and in each of these conservancies, there are conservation management strategies or plans prepared that show how the Department of Conservation will manage the dark green land, which are in conservation ownership, and also how they will advocate for conservation in the rest of the areas. These areas are also pretty close, certainly Canterbury and Otago and Southland and West Coast are pretty close to the regional council boundaries. There's a little bit different up the top there, which doesn't really matter too much. And so we have regional councils as well that are local, which are basically the local government authorities, and they're operating quite separately from the Department of Conservation, which is a central government agency. So we've got local regional councils operating these, and we also have a number of district councils, local authorities also working around here. So Queenstown Lakes District Council is just a small area of the upper catchment here. And so we have a number of different administrative bodies or governance bodies who have different types of responsibilities in the high country. To illustrate this, statutory plans under the Resource Management Act, our major legislation for planning, is on a cascading hierarchical sort of system. Central government can establish water conservation orders over particular water bodies, and so there's a couple of rivers that go into the high country have water conservation orders on them that restrict what can be done to them. There are national standards issued on things like forestry and various other things like that, freshwater standards, and national policy statements. And all of these have to be given effect to by regional councils through regional policy statements, which set out the issues in the region and what they're going to do about them. And regional plans, which have largely been optional, but have now become mandatory due to national policy statements requiring them for freshwater management. So freshwater management has become the major issue in farming areas, and every council has to produce a regional plan for freshwater management. And the regional plans and district plans, which deal basically with land use, have to be not inconsistent with each other, but they both have to give effect to the regional policy statements and therefore to the higher order requirements. But that's not all that's involved in the governance systems for the high country. There are a number of other statutory plans. I've mentioned the conservation management strategies prepared by Conservation Board and the Department of Conservation. There are also national park and reserve management plans, usually prepared in conjunction with the conservation management strategies or related to them. The national park plans produced by the Department of Conservation, some of the reserves by them, others by local authorities if it's a local authority reserve. So there's various types of reserves and reserve management plans. The Biosecurity Act deals with pest management, and there are pest management plans prepared by regional councils. These deal with named pests like rabbits or particular grasses that might be of concern. There's a Wild Animal Control Act for managing mountain goats and so on. I probably should have said from the outset that for those of you who don't know, New Zealand had no animals in it when it was before the arrival of humans. Humans brought the Polynesian rat, came with Maori, and a bunch of other species arrived with the Europeans when they arrived, and were settled and have acclimatized and have found New Zealand very, very comfortable home for them. No natural predators, so they tend to run wild and cause us all sorts of problems for the indigenous biodiversity, which wasn't used to dealing with animals. So we have Wild Animal Control Acts, we have a Wildlife Act. Each of these have plans and so on under them to manage various aspects of the high country species. And we also have fish and game plans developed by the Fish and Game New Zealand for managing freshwater fish and game birds and things like that. So I've got a plethora of different governance bodies and different plans and so on, all operating in the high country and all operating on the high country farmers. Farmers have to operate within these. So the crunch point has arrived for the high country farmers in New Zealand, and they're starting to feel it. This is the new regulatory landscape that's come through these plans, especially through the Resource Management Act and the Land and Water Plans. What is happening throughout the country, it's already happened in Canterbury, is essentially that farmers, even if they've been farming like I have on our, like my family has on our farm, we're lowland farmers, but even if you've been farming for 150 years or more, or your land has been farmed for 150 years or more, you now must get permission to farm. And the basis for this permission is that while you can do what you want with your land, you cannot have adverse effects on things that is not yours. So if you have any off-farm effects on things like water, then it's a polluter pays approach. You're the polluter, therefore you have to pay, and you have to prove to people that you're not damaging the common property, which is the fresh water, the air, and things like that. Biodiversity is also considered a common resource for the country. So if you have a patch of indigenous biodiversity on your property, which is of high value, then you have to be able to show how you're going to maintain that biodiversity. And so these plans that to get permission to farm, farmers must produce a plan showing how they're going to keep within keep their environmental effects within specified limits. And those will be limits on nutrient and chemical loss to groundwater or to rivers and so on, sediment loss. Coming in the future is almost certainly going to be greenhouse gas emissions, e.g. from stock emissions. They used to call it the fart tax when they were trying to tax it. Now they're controlling it through people having to estimate what their greenhouse gas emissions will be from their farm. This will come into effect probably in the next couple of years. It's not with us yet. And water take, of course, to maintain the healthy environmental flows in the water bodies, so that they're good for the Maori values, for the recreational values, etc. And as I mentioned, they have to maintain or enhance indigenous biodiversity on their land, as well as maintaining the productive capacity of the land for future generations. And once they get their permission, with their farm environment plan as condition on getting that permission, that farm environment plan will be independently audited, and they will also be independently monitored. So their water takes all have to be telemetered, showing that they are, ongoing current monitoring externally of how much water is being taken, and an independent auditor will come in and check that what they're doing on their farm is in accordance with their farm environment plan at least once every 3 years. And you have to operate within those plans. As I said, at the moment, this has largely been done in Canterbury, but is now being rolled out across the country. That adds considerable cost for any farmer, especially if you're in a high country farm. You've got a bit of mountain land there, depending on which direction your the slope faces, you'll have different impacts or ability to absorb nutrients and chemicals. So there are some significant implementation problems. You have lack of baseline information, including trends and fluctuations over time. I've just been involved in a hearing down in Otago, and there's very little information on which to base how to manage the waterways on those farms. The modelling tools that we're using something called Overseer, which was developed to work out how much nutrients to put on farms, is now being used to calculate the level of nutrients that is lost from a farm. Hasn't been tested or developed on much of the soils in New Zealand. And again, depending in a high country farm, if you've got one mountain, you might have to do anywhere between 14, 17, maybe more different modelling exercises on different slopes on those farms. A number of the rules require you to fence stock away from water bodies. And if you have ephemeral streams, then it can be quite tricky as to how you actually decide which streams you have to fence off and which ones you don't. There's also the integrity of the compliance monitoring system. How good is the monitoring system for these sort of areas? Is it, and the cost of doing that is significant. So all this is adding considerable costs to farmers, which is adding a lot of stress to them. And all this at the time when people are talking about being resilient to climate change, COVID and stuff like that. Our Rural Support Trust, our Farm Strong outfits who provide mental health support to farmers are really being pressed these days by the pressure on farmers. So this is a major issue. There is quite a high suicide rate on farms as well, which is of concern. So what's the alternative? One of the ones that we have been looking at in our paper is this concept of industrial symbiosis, where industries form networks through linked systems for mutual benefit. And those might be issues where waste product from one company becomes the raw material for another. And then you can use that to enhance your green branding and your product sales and things like that. Certification systems, things like that. And in some areas, the idea is that that farmers could have their collective land, have a body of governance, or in some of these industries, these industrial symbiosis sort of setups, they're referred to as eco-industrial complexes. This has usually been developed more in urban or densely populated areas like Denmark, places like that, or sometimes promoted as industrial parks by eco-industrial parks by various governments as part of a development strategy. We don't do any of that in New Zealand. That's government interfering with the marketplace. That's not neoliberal. That is not leaving things to the private individual. This is sort of seen as bad in terms of our traditional way of doing things. So we have been sort of wondering about how to do this. And one of the things that seems to have happened overseas that's driven a lot of this has been a desire to reduce compliance costs with regulatory measures. Seems to have been something that's kicked off some of the original self-developed ones. So we were sort of wondering if this could work in the New Zealand high country to create eco-agricultural complexes. And we're wondering what that would look like in the New Zealand context, how we'd move beyond what an eco-agricultural complex would look like. And we figured that the key thing about it would be to be moving beyond the individual farm boundaries to establish green infrastructure. Now that would mean riparian restoration or planting that stretches down an entire watershed catchment, the sharing of water supplies, sharing of different ways of doing things, but also working in with the urban areas, because as I highlighted, there's a lot of interest in the high country. We can't just think of farmers in this. So it means building a strong connection between the rural and the urban, between the various sectors, the tourism sectors and so on, and trying to make this work in some sort of bioregional integrated approach. And would probably follow a collaborative gifts and gains type mechanism where people get together and decide what they give up in return for what they gain out of this. And this gifts and gains type approach has worked quite well in a number of other areas of commons in New Zealand, in the marine area, for instance, with fishing and other interests. So sort of look at how that might work, what's the possibilities. And of course, we immediately run to the geography of the country. This is sparsely populated. People are spread out, and it's hard to get the critical mass to enable sort of the industries to come together in the same way. We have to think of different types of industries and how to do that. There's a tradition, the idea that people don't want to shift away from the traditional farming approaches or from operating in a sort of a neoliberal philosophy. But if you have, for instance, regenerative farming trying to be set up on one farm and organic certification, things like that, it may be quite hard for them to connect up with the neighbouring farm, which might be quite industrial by comparison and not interested in regenerative farming. The time frames and the costs are quite constricting. A lot of pressure on people to change immediately overnight, and these things take time. And one of the things that seems to matter to farmers is that they like to have evidence, but they also like tangible models. They like to be able to go and see examples of things before they necessarily try them out. So in this sense, we started to think of Mount Grand Station as a catalyst. So how do we make an eco-agricultural complex happen if we think it is a good thing to do? Well, the driver, compliance costs, has already arrived and is arriving with, and is ongoing arrival with these, move to probably carbon. There's probably going to be requirements for biodiversity plans and so on farms as well. And so we've got all the compliance costs there. What we therefore need is sort of a catalyst farm or a farming community or organisation to create an integration between the various sectors of the various farms and so on. And that needs a mandate from the wider community, say well beyond simply the farmers. And it will require patience and the longevity of key players involved in that process. Now, as I said, the compliance costs have already arrived. So we were thinking we need to look at how to put together an eco-agricultural complex, how to make things different. But then it sort of occurred to us that maybe it's already happening. And in fact, in the very area that Mount Grand is, which is here, the station, lies within the Upper Clutha catchment of the high country, and quite near to Mount Grand, Wanaka. They've developed the Y Wanaka, which is focused on water and driven in part by the demands on water and in part on the water quality. But they've seen the quality of water as being a uniting theme for all of the users of the high country. And so by focusing on water and on the requirements to plan in accordance with water, they decided to get proactive, not wait to have regulations imposed on them, but to get the community working on an action plan. And this was developed with planning professionals. This map is actually taken from their community catchment plan. That was developed in part by LandPro, planning agency down there, and the community. And in it, they have 60 actions as to what they can do. And those are time framed over short term, medium term, long term actions. And they'll involve various different bodies to carry them out. Professionally driven in some respects, but very much community engaged as well. There's been lots of surveys, consultations shaping the future, sort of plans to develop shared visions for the waterways in this area. It's also, it's clearly involved both urban and rural, and instead of talking about farm environment plans, they talk more about business environment plans. So it's not just a farming thing, it is for every business that they have to think about their environmental impacts. And that helps to get over the split between rural and urban dwellers in New Zealand and really focus people on the concept of what we're trying to achieve. So this has actually come about in large part because of the pressures from the government on improving the water and on water take and on the environment. So it's come about from this demand, this neoliberal philosophy that you have to deal internally with your issues. You have to internalize the externalities. You have to, the polluter has to pay. But because that drive is coming on, it's united the farming community and various urban businesses having to pollute the waterways, and drawing them together, and they're trying to find a way of working together to go way beyond what's actually envisaged in those in that government sort of protection of water, but using the water as a key connector. Is that going to be enough to create an eco-agricultural complex? Will they then move to connecting the various services that are available from the ecosystems with new businesses, with the waste from the rural area being processed in the city and vice versa? How are they going to work this? At this stage, it's not really focused on the economic side so much. It's focused more on how to deal with the environmental effects, and each person doing their own sort of thing in line with the plan. And there are a number of barriers here. High country stations face succession issues as the younger generations don't necessarily want to continue on the farms. There are pressures from off-farm owners for profits where a farm has been in the family for a long time, and one person left on the farm. The other members of the family expect to get a certain return from it through the trust. So they press for more income from the farms than possibly it can produce if it's being operated sustainably. There's a lot of wealthy elite, on the other hand, purchasing stations, and they may be separate from the community, outside of the normal community, staying quite isolated. A number of those people are international people. And a lot of the urban residents are short term. They have holiday homes, or they are tourists on an extended vacation, working in cafes or other sorts of things as they tour around the country and from overseas. So they don't necessarily build up a connection with the place. On the other hand, a lot of the holiday home people build up a strong connection, but they have a connection in terms of their holiday, not necessarily a working life, and they're not necessarily there year round to engage with and be connected. So those are the things that we think will be really difficult for the community to deal with. But at present, all of these are recognised, and elements of these are all involved in the Waiwanaka program. So it seems to be quite an interesting one to follow for the next probably couple of decades. But the key thing here is to remember that the governance regime is currently neoliberal, but it seems to be driving this community development through forcing a focus on the environmental effects. And I guess the crunch point for us here is, given that this is already happening, and it's happening under neoliberal sort of arrangements, is there actually a need to do something different? Is there any sort of rationale, any basis to argue for, say, farmers being paid for the public benefit that comes from their use of land? Or are we already quite correctly focused on them internalising the externalities? And that's really where we've ended up. We're not sure that we need to change to a community type approach, a deliberate communal approach, because we seem to be getting that already from the system we have. So we're going to be watching the Waiwanaka very closely to see if that can then be replicated in other parts of New Zealand if it works. Thank you for your attention. I hope that gives you some food for thought and discussion. I look forward to any comments or discussion that arises.
You're looking at the example of Waiwanaka as a sort of eco community type of approach, or eco-industrial kind of approach. I mean, Europe, there's a lot of similar ideas here, many of them based around particular commodities. So let's say cheeses, there's often communal approaches towards farmers working together for particular cheese industries. So have you looked into Europe to see whether there are any lessons that can be learned for New Zealand from that, given the fact that Europe is a highly subsidized system, whereas at the moment New Zealand is not?
I guess that was our starting problem, is that we're not sure where the subsidies would come from to help to facilitate that. But we have been looking at some of the practices that have been occurring in terms of, for instance, the wool area and development of branding, certainly in New Zealand. But sorry, I should have said that before. My co-authors have looked at Europe to some extent, but just that coming back to the element of subsidy that goes into that. And in New Zealand context, we are having in various places, branding being developed, as in the New Zealand Merino wool brand. But then you run into problems that you end up with a monocultural brand. All the wool price has crashed for everything except merino. So we now have merino wool used in carpets and all sorts of stuff, which is not really possibly the best thing for it to be used in. So we're going to have, there's issues around those sort of branding and development as well. It's can be quite tricky.
Yeah, I mean, obviously subsidies can lead to perverse outcomes, unfortunately, within systems. But I mean, I would argue that many of the subsidies, particularly in the hill country and in Europe, are driven as a public good subsidy to maintain agricultural activity, to manage land, rather than necessarily as a way of anti-competitive processes. And so New Zealand's similar in that much of the land there is a public good associated with, as you say, tourism, individual adventurism, all that kind of stuff, which happens because farmers happen to manage land. And so there should be opportunities for public benefit, public subsidy of public benefit within the New Zealand system as well.
That's certainly the argument being made by the farming community. It tends to fall on deaf ears because the counter argument is that they have a responsibility to look after the land for future generations, to manage it sustainably. Otherwise, they're not being good citizens, and therefore it's expected of them. And if they don't do it that way, then they shouldn't be farming.
Right. Okay. Susie, do you want to ask your question? Then we'll go to you, Richard.
Yeah, I was intrigued by, I've never been to New Zealand, and I find it really interesting. And I was intrigued by the contrast between what you were presenting and with you, admittedly, it's mostly a neoliberal sort of setting and so on. And Rennie's talk a few sessions ago, where he talked about the Maori way of relating to the land. And when I asked, how do you, and I mean, I remember you being in that session as well.
Yep.
How does that all kind of intermesh or interrelate or play out in real life? He was saying, well, it's a lot of Maoris who are farmers and they're managing their land and so on. But could you maybe just illustrate a little how that all fits together and where those other ways of relating to land come into designing? I mean, who is designing, who's in charge of that, and who's part of that, and whose values inform that?
So the Resource Management Act is just being changed quite considerably, and the change will require people operating under it to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. But already in the Resource Management Act and in the other legislation, the Conservation Act and so on, there's considerable weight given to the principles of the treaty, the agreement between Maori and the Crown. That's our foundational sort of document. So what that means in practice, and it varies depending on who you talk to, but from my experience, and I've looked at this quite closely and analysed it quite a bit, Māori have a significant say in resource consent processes and in regional plans, increasingly so. So to give you an example on our property, and we aren't high country, we're low country, but we've just had a recent plan released, a proposed district plan. It has our land is in what is called a cultural value zone, which means that if we want to dig a hole deeper than 20 centimetres, other than for a fence post, we have to get resource consent, and the local tribe gets to be asked how they feel about that, and they would put on a condition that if we dig up any bones or any archaeological stuff, then they are, then we have to stop and they come on site. Mahinga kai, food, related stuff around the waterways is a major driver for the water issues. And so the new national policy statement on freshwater management which is driving a lot of the stuff that's happening in the Waiwanaka, says that it prioritises water, and it uses a Maori concept, te mana o te wai. The mana, the status of the water, is the important thing. So the first thing is the water and the ecosystems around that. That's your first priority in considering managing water. Second is community takes from that, whether it's Maori or non-Maori, for drinking and food use. And third is economic. So you only consider the economic use when you've dealt with the other two priorities. The hearing I was in Dunedin just now is right about that. You've got a whole lot of farm consents that are expiring this year for taking water. They have invested heavily in irrigation for up country farmland in the high country there, and for grape growing and stuff like that. The catchment is over allocated, and the argument is that they should not be able to get any new consents to replace the ones that they've got until environmental flows have been established on those rivers. So that provides an incentive for them then to sit down and sort out the data and work out what is a suitable environmental flow, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to use it. In reality, I think what will happen is that the Environment Court, which is hearing the case, will find a compromise and give them a 6-year extension on their existing permits to enable them to transition to a more environmental approach with all the environmental flows there, because no one has actually collected the data to do it. But this is all based on the underlying Maori concept of putting the health of the waterway first, and that's also being extended to land and to biodiversity generally. So it's very much an ecocentric type approach that's being driven through the planning system and reflecting the partnership with tangata whenua. Of course, you'll always find people who say, well, we haven't gone far enough, fast enough, but that's part of that sort of transition that's going on.
Yeah, thanks for your interesting talk, Hamish, to bring some of the historical and current issues into a context with an indication of a way forward. Perhaps just a couple of observations that you might want to react to. The first, in terms of the, how neoliberal are we? And while the farming community, just like any else of the business community in New Zealand, has been forced by government to be very, very independent, it is actually and it is very driven by the consumer preferences, and that's a significant mover. I think you touched upon that in terms of merino marketing groups and wool marketing groups and like that, and meat marketing and so on. And that is almost the biggest shape of that and the environmental pressures that you're getting with government regulation. And a comment on the regulation is that it's not a kind of like a perfect, shall we say, market model, because it actually, the costs of the externalities are actually not charged for and actually taken back to the farmers by any pricing mechanism. It's almost entirely by putting in place environmental limits and regulation, which the environmental limits is now going to be more of a focus of the revised Resource Management Act. So in turn, the farmers are not actually paid subsidies in New Zealand, almost completely. They're also not actually charged for the cost of their externalities. So it is actually strongly regulated model, even though it's in terms of its marketing side, it's what you could call neoliberal. Just a couple of observations that I got out of your talk. And you're quite right, I agree with you. The regulatory side of things is driving the farming community faster and faster to find responses to that. But also the consumer pressures, also where people want to know the complete supply chain story and the carbon impact of their products. And I'll stop there. You might want to respond to some of that, Hamish. Thanks.
I totally agree, and I think that the farmers don't realise that they aren't having to pay the cost of some of their emissions, so the market thing isn't fully working there. We have tried with things like the emissions trading scheme, which is didn't work. In fact, didn't work because farmers had sufficiently powerful lobby group to be left right outside it. So yeah, I basically agree with your point. It is interesting to me. I've got a farmer up the road from me who's contracted by Waitrose, and he's had to for a long time provide evidence of his sustainable farming operation. They have to do bird counts on their property. They have to plant serve natives and so on. They have to do all sorts of stuff. And they've been doing that for more than a decade now. He says it means that in the good years for sheep meat, he doesn't get as much of a profit as some of the others do, but he knows how much money he's getting all the time, and he in the bad years he's secure. And he says it's also been really good to can take his kids out. Then I've quite enjoyed seeing the natives and doing the bird counts and stuff like that. So he's feeling quite positive about that. And that's actually something that a lot of farmers I find quite interesting, is that once they get forced by regulations to do something like fence off an area and look after the waterways, they remember their childhood and playing in the waterways when they're in better quality, and think, oh, I quite like it like this. And they start to take the view that they are now following good management, good farming practice. And in fact, good farming practice is one of the sort of things written into these farm environmental plans, that a good farmer does look after the environment, does look after the soils, does look after the things around there. And it's quite interesting to me to see. I know one farmer who had spent quite a bit of money fencing off his waterways and so on, and he tells everyone how he's being positive towards the environment. That's why he's doing it. But he told me one time, he said, "Oh, of course, if I didn't do this, I would have been fined $10,000 by the local council for letting my stock in here, so I had to do it anyway." But he said, "But once I did it, I'm really quite enjoying it. It's added value to my farm. It looks better, and it's given me a talking point for people." So, it's almost like leading a horse to water and then making them drink, and then they decide they actually like it.